I'm Ramona Thomas, Adams County Clerk and Election Commissioner, and I've been talking to Elaine Landwehr. She was setting up this Zoom meeting, and she gave me some topics that she would like me to start, talking about today. So obviously, we've got the general election coming up on November 3rd, and just wanted to highlight some of the date deadlines. Want to talk about registering to vote, updating your voter registration, and then of course a lot of people are interested in the early voting option, or vote by mail as some people refer to it as. So we're just going to cover some of those. After every section, maybe I'll just stop and see if anyone has any questions, and if you do, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. So obviously the most basic thing when we're talking about the elections is everyone who is eligible to vote needs to register to vote, needs to register at their local election office or through the Secretary of State. So our methods in Nebraska of registering to vote, you can register online through the Nebraska Secretary of State's office, and that's sos.nebraska.gov. And you go to the voter link and it'll walk you through. That's either registering for the first time, or you can also update your voter registration by that method. So if you have moved, you're going to want to update your voter registration so that you're in the correct precinct and voting on the correct things when it comes to election day. And it's just going to save you a lot of time and hassle if you have your voter registration clean. So you know where you need to go on election day. You can also register to vote in person at our office. We are open to the public, all walk-in traffic now at the courthouse, so 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. You can also register to vote through methods such as the Department of Motor Vehicles. If you need to update your driver's license, you can go ahead and update your voter registration at that time too. You can always register to vote by mail using a paper application that you can get online through our website or the Secretary of State site. You can mail that. You can also have someone bring it down for you. You can use the drop box outside of the courthouse. Now the deadlines to do these things differ a little bit depending on the method in which you choose to register. If you choose to register through an electronic method or an agent, so that would be registering to vote online or sending it in the mail or sending an application with somebody, you have till October 16th to submit that application to our office. From October 16th to October 23rd, the only way that you can register to vote and be eligible to vote in the November 3rd election is by doing it in person in our office. And on the 23rd of October, we will be open until 6 o'clock to accommodate some of those last minute registrants. And those dates are set by statute. I provided an outline to Elaine. If you want a copy of this with some of the statute numbers, I'm sure she would be happy to forward that on to you. So those are dates set by the state. They are not set by this office, but they are hard deadlines. There are no exceptions to those. So any questions on just the voter registration process? It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to assume that is a no. So we'll move on to what most people are probably interested in right now, and that is the applying to take advantage of the early voting option, or as I said, some people refer to it as vote by mail. A lot of times it's referred to as absentee. Nebraska likes to use the term early voting. So Nebraska does require all voters apply for an early voting ballot every election. We got several applications for early voting in the primary that the state had sent out, where someone had written on the application, please also sign me up for the general. We need separate applications for every election. Now, early voting is available to all registered voters in Nebraska. We are a no excuse state, which that means you do not have a reason in which, or you don't have to have a reason that you want to take advantage of early voting. You don't have to prove to me that you're going to be out of town or have some other obligation that day. Early voting is open to any registered voter. We just have to have that application on file. So applications for early voters were, applications for early voting were mailed to all active registered voters in our county. That was a decision that myself and my office made. We came to that decision based on the fact that in the primary, the state of Nebraska did send out early voting applications to everyone in the state. It was our feeling, and a lot of the feedback we were getting from our voters, they liked that feature. They liked being given the application. They didn't have to search for it. They didn't have to call and inquire. They didn't have to come in. So we felt that there was somewhat of a precedent set by the state that, this was a convenience our voters liked, and we wanted to continue providing it. So therefore we did send out that mailing, and had it for a few weeks now. We've got a significant number back already. So that is why we sent those out. But if for some reason you didn't get an application, misplaced your application, those applications are always available on our website through the Secretary of State site. You can come in our office and pick one up. Returning of your early voting application. So once you've received your application, you can return that to our office no later than October 23rd. October 23rd, again, that is a hard deadline. That is the date in which we need that early voting application back in order to fulfill your early voting request by mail. Various methods you can return that. You can return it through the mail. As we were discussing a little bit before we started recording the meeting, if you choose to return that postcard by mail, postage is not paid. It's not a two-way mailing. It's fine to fold the postcard and put it in an envelope and you can mail it back to our office, but there are various other ways you can return that. You can put it in a drop box that is outside our courthouse main entrance. You can bring it into our office. You can fax it to our office. You can even take a photo of it with your phone or scan it and email it to us. So you can get that application to us in various ways. It is permissible on the application, only the application, that an agent requests the ballot on your behalf on that. We see this a lot with college kids. Kids away at college, they still consider their parents' home as their primary place of residence. So therefore, mom or dad gets their application, signs for them, maybe has the ballot sent to them at campus, maybe holds the ballot at home until the child's home to vote it. That is permissible on the application only. I lost my place on my outline here, I apologize. So returning voting applications, all those different methods. So the application must be signed by the voter or an agent. POA is permissible. Ballots will start being mailed out from our office on September 28th. We are still building our election in our computer system. The state of Nebraska still has until September 11th to certify all of the candidates and issues that will be on that ballot. So we're fielding a lot of calls right now that I sent in my early voting application. When am I going to get my ballot? We don't even have all the races yet. So we cannot start sending out ballots until the 28th of September. That is again by statute. If I have the ballots early, I still can't mail them before that date. So, but what sending out these applications early has done is it's given our office an opportunity to work them and get them ready. So on September 28th, it's my hope that we are going to put a significant number of those early voting applications in the mail and get them to you as quickly as we can. So if you are wondering of the status of your early voting application, there is a website. It's nebraska.gov/go/voter-check. You can check the status of your early voting application. You can make sure that we got it. You can see if it's been processed. Eventually, you can see if the ballot has been mailed out. And then once you return it, you can see that we logged in your ballot as being returned. What I will say at this point, we are just starting to process those early voting applications. As I told Phyllis earlier before we started recording, I'm guesstimating we have about 3,000 applications sitting there waiting to be processed. We can get through about 400 a day. So until those that application is logged in the system, you're not going to see a status update on that website. But once we log it in, then you can track it from there. So, so I will move on to returning your early voting ballot once you get it. Unless, is there any questions on the early voting application process?
I've got one real quick, Ramona.
Right.
You had mentioned that for every election, you need to request an application. And I think you said that that's available on the county's website, the Secretary of State's website, and in person in your office. Is that the only way to get those, or is there a way to, for future elections, where you may have that mailed to you?
Are you talking future elections where our office would automatically mail you an application?
Well, is that something you're anticipating doing in the future? I mean, I guess this is kind of a hypothetical situation where maybe the world has returned to somewhat normal, but.
Right. Moving forward, that would be my hope, that we can just continue doing this. Some counties will only mail application to those people that have requested early voting in the past. This particular one, we chose to send it to all active voters. Moving forward, I'm sure we're going to do it in some capacity. 2 years from now, we may look at just sending it to those people that did take advantage of the early voting, because these mailings aren't cheap. You know, the postcard mailing that we did was in excess of $10,000. And you know, if I can cut down that expense by only sending it to those people that are likely going to utilize it, that might be what we do, but maybe cross that bridge in 2 years. We'll get through this one first.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions on just the application process? Okay. So we're going to assume that the voter has gone through the application process. They've returned it to our office. We have processed it, and we're going to mail your ballot out to you. So once you get your ballot, our ballots now, I know in the past, if you've taken advantage of early voting, with the exception of the primary, but I'm talking in, you know, a few elections in the past, it used to be a big manila envelope. It used to be an 8.5 by 11, or I'm sorry, it was a legal size envelope. Our new counting equipment does accommodate for a folded ballot. So it's going to be a smaller envelope. So just, you know, make sure you're watching for that. So you'll get your ballot. It's permissible to fold it because that's how it's going to come to you. You vote your ballot, and then the back of the early voting envelope, there's a voter oath that needs to be filled out. There's a place for you to fill in your address, and you sign the envelope. Now, unlike the application, it is not permissible for anyone to sign that ballot other than the person, the voter, other than the voter. Power of attorney cannot be accepted on that. If we have a situation where an individual is unable to sign their name, they need to at very least make their mark, and then someone can write witnessed by. But we absolutely cannot take any other signature than the voter on that. So I know sometimes people wonder what happens to their ballot once they return it to us. And a lot of people will say to me, well, you guys don't go through all those ballots. We absolutely do. We are physically looking at every single ballot returned and matching that signature to the signature we have on file on their voter registration card. So we are looking at every single one of those. So the voter must sign the early voting ballot envelope, agent and POA. I have covered that. They can't sign for that. The early voting ballots may be returned by mail. Again, postage is not paid, so you'd have to put postage on that envelope. The return envelope is provided, but no postage. You may also drop it in the the drop box that's on the west entrance of the courthouse. Of course, you can always bring it into our office in person. If returning by mail, please note postage is not paid. Sorry, I'm just kind of following my outline here, and sometimes I get ahead of myself, so I end up repeating. So all ballots in the election are due in the election office by 8 p.m. on election night. Many years ago, I believe it was permissible for you to go by postmark date. And I don't know the exact reasons that changed. I'm assuming with the advances in the tallying equipment, we count all the votes on election night. So if that ballot is not physically in our office by 8 o'clock election night, it will not be counted. So any questions on the returning of your ballot? The method in which you can return or deadlines, it's pretty straightforward. It's due by the time polls close. You cannot return your early voting ballot to a polling location. It must come to this office. Reason is the election or the polling locations don't close until 8 o'clock. So if you give your early voting ballot to an election worker at a polling site, we're not going to get that application or that ballot until well after 8 o'clock, and all of our early votes have already been processed by that time. So you cannot do that. We've also had a few questions on if someone has requested an early voting ballot, but then decides to go to the polling locations on election day to vote. That is possible, they can do that, but in the voting roster or the voter roster at the polling location, it will say by their name that they have an early voting ballot issued to them. So what that's going to cause is them to have to vote provisionally at the polling site. So people need to be aware that if you request that early voting ballot and we have it issued to you, if you choose not to return it, you may have a little more paperwork to do at the polling site. So that does bring me to election day, and polls are going to be open. I mean, I know with the COVID situation, things kind of unfold day by day, but I think it's fairly safe to say that if we can run a successful election during the month of May, when we were in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's safe to say that in November, we should be able to do the same. So unless things take a very drastic turn, polling locations are going to be open, normal times from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. As of now, we had a few polling location changes in the primary. It looks like those will be the same for the general. The most drastic change was at Good Samaritan Village, so precinct 1C. That location had to be moved to the fairgrounds. It's my understanding that the senior center at Good Samaritan Village is still closed to the public, so 1C will likely remain at the fairgrounds for this election. But if there's any question on your polling site, you could go to the Adams County website, adamscounty.org, and we have a list of polling locations there. Anticipated traffic at the polling sites. Overall, the polling site is anticipated to be low again because we have so many people taking advantage of the early voting option. It's probably fair to say it's going to be busier than the primary, but overall it's still anticipated to be low. So my next section that Elaine wanted me to talk about is provisional ballots and a little bit of what that is. So is there any questions leading up to now with the polling locations or?
I have a question for you,
Sure.
Ramona. How are you doing with, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. How are you doing with getting poll workers?
Well, most of the people that had worked the primary have confirmed that they are willing to work the general.
Okay.
We worked with what I'd consider a skeleton crew in the primary, which worked fine because the turnout at the polling sites was minimal. So many of the polling sites, we only had 3 people staffed per precinct. I would still like some of our bigger precincts to be staffed with that 5 that we like to be at. 3 in many of our, especially our rural precincts, would probably be sufficient. But it just makes it real difficult for even, a bathroom break for the election workers. And so I would like to get back up to that 5. We'll see. We haven't been out soliciting yet. That's going to come in early September.
Okay, thank you.
So did anyone here work the polling site on election day for May? And how was that?
I did, Ramona.
This is Deb. I'm sorry. This is Deb Sherrick. Yes, I worked. My husband worked. It wasn't busy. It was very easy to work through. So.
And how many people did
That's all
you
I
have
had.
at your site?
I had 2 precincts at my site, and we staffed it with 4 people for each precinct, and that included myself.
I worked at the Barrett Center, and we had 2 precincts. There was 4 workers for one. This is Elaine. And there were 5 workers for the other one. And we got along fine.
See, and we have had some service groups. Was it Belva? Did you email me about a service group that was interested? Or no, it wasn't you. Okay.
I worked the airport, and we had 1 hour until 5 o'clock, so it was pretty slow.
It was very slow.
And we had a couple people who had to, redo their mail-in ballot because they forgot it at home or something like that and hadn't mailed it in yet and didn't want to make the trip to the post office, to the courthouse. So, yeah.
This is Deb Sherrick, and the Hastings Noon Sertoma Club. I had emailed it to you, and they are considering doing this as a service project.
Okay. Yeah, and that's real simple. I don't think I've gotten back to you yet, but it is as simple as the election worker. They'll fill out their pay sheet, but then there's also a sheet that we can provide that says, I want my wages to go to, and it's a service organization, and then the check is just forwarded to that organization instead of the individual. It's actually been permitted for a few years now, but we're seeing several counties really trying to promote it now just to recruit election workers. So that is an option. And I know with League of Women Voters, a lot of y'all are election workers anyway, so I don't know how beneficial it would be to your group, but that is an option for some of those groups out there to make some money. And I know a lot of their fundraisers have been canceled, so this could be a good opportunity to recoup some of those funds.
Ramona, I want to kind of talk about, could you speak to a lot of what we're hearing about is how mailing in your ballots is unsafe, and the connection with the post office and this election?
I knew someone was going to ask that. I'm not even sure how to answer that because we are not seeing anything here. I mean, obviously we're not seeing anything here at our level in the county. I'm not even hearing anything from other clerks. I'm not getting any advisements from the state level that this is a concern at all. And And I see in here, you know, a lot of times I try to disconnect from the media when it comes to this stuff. But of course, I've seen and heard a lot of what you all have. I don't know if there is an issue here, if this is a true issue somewhere else, but we're certainly not seeing it. Now, this is not new information that the mailing process seems to take longer. There's times I'll mail something just in town to another Hastings address and it could take 3 or 4 days. The days where you put it in the mailbox and it's to your destination the next day, that's probably done, but that's nothing new. So if it's November 2nd and you haven't returned your early voting ballot, I would plan on making a trip to Hastings, or I'd plan on going to the polls that day and fill out a provisional because you didn't get that returned. But here I see no reason to put any blame on the Postal Service. I honestly have not seen a change.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or Elaine wanted me to talk about provisional ballots briefly. Okay, we'll just kind of move on to that. So provisional ballots, it's always very confusing for people. And just number one, what is a provisional ballot? And even though it's the term provisional ballot, provisional voting actually refers more to the process in which you cast your ballot as opposed to the ballot itself. A provisional ballot is required when there's a question of the voter's eligibility to vote in the election at all, or a question if they're at the right polling location for which they live, or in a primary election, maybe there's a question of their political affiliation. So the reason we do a provisional ballot is, number one, the process includes a voter registration. So there's obviously an issue with the individual's voting record. Maybe they moved and didn't update it. So part of the provisional process is getting a current voter application on file. So they will have that to fill out at the polling site. So once all the paperwork's filled out, they vote the same ballot as anyone else at that polling location would. But they do put it in a special secrecy envelope that we can isolate from the other ballots. So on election night, those provisional ballot envelopes can be removed from the regular ballots. They are not counted that night because what we have to do is go through the paperwork and determine if that person was eligible to vote at that polling site, eligible to vote that ballot, eligible to vote that party, whatever the case may be. So that is the reason for a provisional ballot. We hear lots of things about provisional ballots. I've heard people say, well, you only count those if the race is close. No, we count all eligible provisional ballots. If a provisional ballot is rejected for any reason, those ballots are never opened in those envelopes, never counted, but all the accepted ones are counted. So actually what people also don't realize is it's not me or my staff that's determining if those provisional ballots count. It's our Adams County Canvassing Board. And they may request some information from us to validate that voter, but ultimately the decision is up to them if those votes count. So there's got to be questions on provisional ballots, I would think.
Ramona, this is Ann Hinton, and I'll just say we did have, I believe it was either 2 or 3 provisional ballots at the primary, but it was all because they had filled out for the early voting and therefore, and didn't turn their ballots in. And we had nothing else besides that.
Right. And I'm a little concerned you might have quite a bit of that because I think there are people that are applying for the early voting ballot, but if the COVID environment, or if our environment stays the same or improves, they might decide then to go to the polling location at that point, not realizing that they're already going to be marked as an early voter, then have to go through that paperwork process. So you're probably going to see that again in the general election. Typically, traditionally, the reason for a provisional ballot is the voter goes up to the check-in table at the polling location and their name's not listed on the roster. And it's usually because that individual perhaps moved, did not update their registration, perhaps they're at the wrong polling location in which they're assigned. That was typically the reason we would do a provisional ballot. But as Ann said, with everything that's going on, I would anticipate that her scenario is going to be seen more.
This is Ann again. I'll just say it does take them quite a bit longer to vote when they have to fill out the provisional, because there is a lot that they have to put in their, what do I want to say, that the oath on the front or whatever that tells why they're doing it that way.
Right, and it's quite a bit for the voter to fill out, but it's also quite a bit for the election worker to fill out. And you know, if you have a line, and I mean, it could hold up voting. And in your scenario where they're just listed as an early voter, it was unnecessary. You know, they're in the roster, they're at the right polling location, they're submitting documentation that actually our office already has. So it would be nice if we could get the word out there, you know, and we do tell people when they come in, you know, if you get an early voting ballot, you're kind of committing to voting that way. Otherwise, it's gonna be a little bit of a hassle. It's not undoable, but inconvenient. Any other questions on provisionals? Or no, Elaine asked if I talked about some of the boards that we have. I know you all are familiar with our election workers that work at the polling locations on election day, but I don't think people are always aware of the other boards, election boards, that are comprised of members of the public that we utilize. We have our early voting or absentee board, and that is a group of people that meet a few days before election day, and they prep our early voting ballots for counting. What they do is they double check the envelopes that come back, make sure our office hasn't missed any that don't have signatures. They will then open the ballots in a manner that preserves the voter's privacy. They are looking for things such as multiple ballots returned in one envelope, which is not permissible. They will reject any of those. And then they're basically just prepping the good ballots, the accepted ballots, for counting, flattening them, putting them in a locked box, and securing them until election day when we count them. Then our receiving board. This is the board that we're currently set up in the basement of the Adams County Annex building, just to the north of the main courthouse. The receiving board is who is going to check in the supplies from the polling locations that the workers are bringing in. And they're going to make sure that the election workers bring back, of course, the voted ballots. They're going to make sure that they bring back any unvoted ballots, ballots they didn't use that day, and their paperwork's in order. So that board is going to make sure that all of those things are done election night. Then, of course, we have our counting board. Our counting board sits in the election room. They're observing counting. They're also prepping the ballots from the polling locations to go through the tabulation machine. What that includes is looking for initials of the election workers on every ballot. and then just physically prepping them to go through the machine, flattening them out, putting them all the same direction. And then of course they're observing counting. So, you know, sometimes I think people have the perception that it's just maybe myself in the election room counting these ballots on election night, and that's simply not the case. It's, we typically have about 10 people on our counting board. There's a technician from our election system and software, which is our election supply provider. They're there overseeing, I'm overseeing. We usually have a county sheriff there. So there's many, many eyes on this process.
Ramona?
Yeah.
Do those workers take an oath as well as the people at the polling place?
Yes, they sign the same oath.
Okay. And which workers are responsible for comparing the signatures with the voter rolls?
The signatures with the voter rolls, signatures on the early voting ballots.
Right.
Well, that is done electronic. Well, that's done as they come in through our office.
So that's not done by a person?
No, it's done by myself or my staff.
Right.
Beforehand. When we get your ballot, so when you send your ballot in, Phyllis, we'll get it. At that time, the day we get it, we will check it in and we physically look at the signature. I think many years ago when it was a paper system and there was a board that would actually pull a physical voter card and match the signatures. Well, now I still see the actual signature, but it's a scanned copy displayed on our computer screen that's linked to our voter system. So we are now able to verify that signature when the ballot comes in.
Okay.
Still an
So
actual person verifying an actual signature. We don't do scanning. We don't use a scanning method at all.
So for the primary, how many, did you have any situations where ballots were disqualified because of the signatures not matching?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say it's not a lot. What we do in our office is we'll send a letter out to that individual and say, your signature is significantly different than that we have on file. It does give them the opportunity to come into our office with an ID and sign again. People's signatures do change over the years, which we accommodate for a lot of that. You know, if the formation of the letters are the same, but maybe it's a little shaky over the years, you know, we can accommodate that, or we can, you know, to me, that's common sense. But if it's significantly different, we will question it.
So you have a ballpark figure about how many were questioned in the primary?
There is a report I can run that has the rejected early voting ballots and the reason in which they were rejected. I didn't run that report. For a not matching signature, I would guess in the primary, it's probably less than 20. I mean, that is just a guess. It's not a significant number. And a lot of those people do end up coming in with their ID and say, you know, yeah, I changed my signature over the year for whatever reason.
And are you
not something I foresee as a problem?
Okay, good.
But the vast majority of the early voting ballots that are rejected is because the person just doesn't fill out the back of the envelope at all.
Right.
That is most of them.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I got to canvassing board. So canvassing board meets after the tabulation process. They can meet yet election night. It's usually a long night, so they usually convene the next morning and they verify the results. And they also go through, that's when the provisional ballots, they start that process of going through and verifying provisional ballots. deciding which ones are going to be counted, which ones are not. Again, they review the results, and they are the ones that actually certify the election. And basically make sure I did my job, my staff did their job, the election workers did their job, and they verify all those results. So typically we will meet 3 or 4 days after the election. They will also look for any write-in. If there's any write-in candidates, filed a write-in candidate affidavit, they will search for those write-ins and log the results accordingly.
Ramona, did having the mail-in ballots slow your getting the results of the election?
No.
Okay, because that's what you hear. You know, you aren't gonna know for weeks how the election turned out.
Well, I hope we're not in that situation. We were able to, as chaotic as it was in the primary, and we had a shorter window of time to get those applications out, get those applications back, send the ballot out, get the ballot back. It was craziness back in May, if you all remember. I mean, everything was up in the air. Didn't know if polling locations were gonna run, just everything was unknown. So the good thing about this time around is we got those applications out to people early. So we're still, what, 66 days out from the election, and y'all have had those applications for a couple weeks now. We've been getting them back. So hopefully we're gonna be able to stay on top of the demand. But the reason I think you hear that, it's usually pertaining to larger counties. If they have a flood of ballots come in just the last few days, they might not be able to get those all processed in time for counting on election night. Being a smaller, medium-sized county, I guess, we have been able to stay on top of it, so.
Ramona, this is Judy Sandine. I have a question about the boards. How are people chosen to serve on those boards?
Well, they're usually veteran election workers who have worked at polling locations for some time. We do still have to be respectful of the rule of a balanced representation of political parties. So just like at the polling locations where we have to have maybe a Republican, a Democrat, nonpartisan voter, we have to have an array of representation. So we have to be mindful of that. But actually anybody can contact our office and say they're interested in doing that. The people that have been serving on those boards tend to really like that spot. So we don't always need people for those positions because they do find it enjoyable.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So any other questions?
Ramona,
Right. Yep.
this is Elaine. I mean, if there are other questions about the boards, go ahead and ask your question about the board. Okay, if there aren't any more questions about the boards, when I heard you speak at the Chamber of Commerce, you talked about the comparison between like the 2016 and the 2018 and the 2020 election. Can you kind of go over that briefly, or do you have that information with you?
I do, I have that with me. So some interesting numbers. So polling location, this is the turnout of voters at the polling sites in 2016, the 2016 general election. And the reason I chose 2016 is because it was a presidential election. So if we want to compare apples to apples, that is the best election to use. So in Adams County, there were 11,287 people that showed up at the polling sites to vote. I'm sorry, I want to back up. I want to back up and I want to use primary. I want to compare primary to primary, sorry. So at the 2016 primary election in Adams County, 6,467 showed up at the polling locations. In 2020, so back in May, we only had 1,288 countywide go to their polling sites. But the early voting, if we look at 2016, early voters in 2016 primary were 765 people. That's minimal. In 2020, so back in May, we processed 6,559 early voters. So when I'm looking forward to the general, they're frightening numbers. In the 2016 general election, 11,287 people went to the polling sites. So our office could be anticipating having to fill 11,000 plus early voting requests. Early voters for the 2016 general were 2,313. So if May is any indication of what November is going to be, those figures will likely be flip-flopped. And we'll be looking at roughly 2,500 people at the polling sites and 11,000 plus that our office has to process via early voters. So that's a task. Our office not only serves as the election office, we are the payroll office for the county, and we are the accounts payable for the county, involved with board meetings. So this is a task for us. So that is another reason we got those applications out as early as possible, because it's going to be lots of nights and weekends.
Do we have any other, this is Elaine again, do we have any other questions for Ramona about any of the things she covered, registering, applying for early voting, getting your ballot, returning your ballot, voting in person, election day?
Question on the primary. Were there an increase in provisional ballots over previous elections, previous primaries?
For this one in May?
Mm-hmm.
No, there wasn't an increase because there just weren't the numbers voting that they weren't going to the polling locations. So I don't know if we can even fairly compare May 2020 to any other election year in the provisionals then. Now, typically in a presidential general, we're of course going to see the most provisional ballots, because there are people that will only vote those elections. That is the only thing that brings them out to vote, is a presidential general. So the turnout's greater, so of course the provisional votes are greater. But as Ann Hinton brought up her scenario, I do anticipate that maybe to that reason that someone requested the early voting ballot and chose not to do it. I would anticipate us having more of those than we ever have before. Does that answer that at all, Phyllis?
Yes, ma'am, it did. Thank you.
Ramona, this is Belva. How do you determine a valid write-in vote? Does it have to be spelled exactly correct?
Well, no. And write-ins are a little different now than they have been for us in the past. See, what most people are unaware of, for most offices, you have to file as a write-in candidate. The only offices that allowed, in Adams County anyway, the only offices where random write-ins were permissible were village boards and township boards. In those instances, I'm assuming it's because they struggle to get people to run for those positions anyway. Those very small boards, they did allow random write-ins. That statute was changed, I think, a couple years ago. And now even those boards require a write-in affidavit. So you file your write-in affidavit to be a write-in candidate. It does allow us to count any name, with that name, the last name, or a reasonably close given just clerical error. So a common misspelling of a name, we can overlook that if a write-in affidavit is filed, which for all of our offices is now required anyway.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right, Ramona, again, this was Ramona Thomas. She's our Adams County Clerk. She's our Adams County Election Commissioner. And Ramona, we thank you very much for coming. We thank you for providing all this information. And I will send the information to Belva so she can get it out to our members. Thank you, Ramona, for writing all of your information out and having it in this handy dandy outline form so that everybody can get the information and have it and know the dates. It's so important that people know the dates that everything has to be in by. And so that will be important as well. So Ramona, thank you very much for coming. And yes, a hand for Ramona. And Chris, you can stop recording now.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
I will just make a mention that this will be on the public access channel, and we can send the links out to the membership.
Thank you, Chris.